This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to this public lecture by Her Majesty, Professor Dr. Frances Smith Foster. Obviously a celebrity. It's a privilege to have all of you here. Thank you so much for coming. My name is John Whitty. I serve as director of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion, which is sponsoring this evening's festivities. This is the third of a trio of lectures, public lectures that we've heard here on the pursuit of happiness in interdisciplinary perspective. We've summoned the perspectives of history, of philosophy, of ethics, of theology, of positive psychology, of various social sciences, of political theory, trying to unpack the meaning of the pursuit of happiness, trying to understand how it's measured, looking at impediments to its proper pursuit, looking at ways by which it can be achieved and who facilitates and supports those ways. And we've explored that in a number of different historical and contemporary communities. We've looked at it through a variety of different disciplinary lenses. But this evening we have the opportunity of focusing this question, especially in the area of literature, in all of its forms, and particularly in the African American communities that have produced literature over the past 250 years. And we have the privilege of listening to a world authority on this subject, Professor Frances Smith Foster. She is the Howard Candler Professor of Literature and Women's Studies here at Emory. She is also the former director of the Women's Studies Center. She is a world authority on African American literature generally from the 18th to the 20th century, but is focused especially on women's literature and the various types of literature that inform African American communities' multiple understandings of religion, of marriage, of sexuality, and as we'll hear this evening, of happiness. She has written scores of articles. She's published 14 books. Her most recent book is Til Death or Distance Doth Us Part, Love and Marriage in African America, and a companion collection of wonderfully edited materials from the archives from the 18th to the 20th century of the same title. She is the editor of the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. She is the editor of the Oxford Companion to African American Literature, and she is the editor and contributor to a variety of critical editions of women authors in the African American tradition who have left us exquisite works historically foreclosed to us or lost in archives that she has brought into brilliant new light and life. She has been highly decorated for her work. She's won prestigious fellowships at Harvard Divinity School, at Brandeis University, at ITC in town, at Emory University. She has been the University Scholar Teacher at Emory. She has won honorary doctorates, and this year she is the winner of the Hubble Prize from the MLA, a major distinction for her and a great credit to Emory University, who live vicariously off of her triumphs. I have known her as a gracious and genius giant who has enlivened our discourse in our Center for the Study of Law and Religion with her courageous thought, with her imaginative reflection, with her brilliant pen, and with her very, very wholesome wit. I give you, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Frances Smith Foster to regale us this evening.
Isn't John Whitty an amazing storyteller? I've listened to his introductions before in awe, and I wished actually that one day I could hear him make me sound as interesting and important as he actually did tonight. And so you've fulfilled one of my fantasies, John. Thank you very much. And I thank all of you for coming out this evening. I don't know who we're waiting for in the front, but they must be delayed by traffic or something. And you all, I don't know. I can't see you. That might be why you're back there. I titled my talk, Making Happiness in Early African America. And since this is a title in a series on the pursuit of happiness, it might seem a little bit odd or even counterintuitive, I think. So I'll start off by doing an English teacher thing. I'll explicate I'll tell you what all these words are about. I'll begin with African America, because that might be a term that you're not as used to hearing as, say, African American. If so, you're not the Lone Ranger in this. I Googled, and it took Google 0.23 seconds to identify 38,900,000 hits for African American. But it took Google longer, 0.24 seconds, to come up with 180,000 hits for African America. And in fact, Google asked me at the top of that, are you sure you didn't mean African American? And most of the 180,000, I didn't look at all of them because the first ones were all African American, and so I just said, okay. But I use African America in my work as Ira Berlin and some others do, in a very consciously political way to evoke a result of slavery and segregation in the United States history. It's a country that's a country of head and heart that provides, you know, here's one of these words that I know how to say, and suddenly, succor, if not safety. Hope despite hardship, and happiness if one works hard enough to make it happen. And I know that for most of you, when it said early, you wondered how early. Did I mean like 1954, Brown versus, in the law school you say Brown v., right? Brown v. Board of Education, which allowed some children to go outside of African America to school. Or the Civil Rights Act of 1968, when some Americans of African ancestry who could afford to could buy houses that were for a while outside the physical boundaries of African America. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, when African Americans could vote in U.S. American elections, or am I going way back to the pre-20th century, to the Civil Rights Act of 1864, and the flurry of laws and not one but 3 constitutional amendments designed to convert freedmen into U.S. citizens. And actually, I want to go back that far and further and up to late as yesterday. I'm going to emphasize antebellum period from about 1827 to 1860, but I hope you'll see that its implications for and similarities, almost astonishing, with the early colonial period as well as the 21st century are in this conversation. So, African America, early. Making. I chose making over the pursuit of happiness because I believe that making and pursuing are both action verbs, but they're not synonyms. They don't mean the same thing. And pursuit can be a sprint, or it can be a marathon, or it can be a lifelong exercise, and it doesn't really imply accomplishment. Making does. The pursuit of happiness can be futile and can make the pursuer depressed, distressed, passive, despairing. But when one makes happiness, there's a different endeavor. Making is a process too, but it implies a product. It implies self-motivation, some measure of control, some skill, and using some materials to make something, to create something else. You're not supposed to use the same word to define as you use that you're defining. Okay. It implies a product. The happiness experts tell us that just thinking that we're making progress creates happiness. In fact, I've even read a recipe for making happiness. In the happiness hypothesis, Jonathan Haidt gives this formula: H equals S plus C plus V. In this, H is happiness. S is the set point that many scientists say is our biologically determined thermostat, which registers our emotions. C is our condition, which includes the generally unchangeable, such as sex or cultural heritage, and that over which most of us have some control, which would be wealth, associates, where you live, etc. And V is voluntary actions. Now, that's enough, I think, of this explication. The only word I haven't tried to define is happiness. But, truth be told, I don't know what it is. I don't know how to define it for sure. George Lowenstein declares that happiness is a signal that our brains use to motivate us to do certain things. And I find that a pretty cold and non-helpful definition. It makes me unhappy. However, from my research and from reading up on this stuff, I realize that very few, if any, scholars find it necessary to define the happiness about which they write. They just talk about it. And, I think it's kind of like pornography. We know it when we feel it. So Antebellum African American print culture is my primary treasure trove. It generally extols a positive correlation between happiness and marriage. In an 1859 essay he called Matrimony, Daniel Payne wrote that marriage is God's design and was instituted in a place of pristine beauty and purity in the seat of happiness and immortality. And it's upon love and marriage in early America that I want to focus this evening, beginning with the 18th century two letters that suggest African Americans' determination to define and to discipline marriage of themselves for themselves. And I'll quickly move to some examples of ways in which antebellum African American print culture taught about courtship, marriage, gender, and family relationships, about making them happy ever after. And I conclude with Patrick Brown's First Love, a short story about ill effects that might befall outsiders who interfere with one's making of happiness. On January 6, 1796, Theodore Foster, president of the Abolition Societies of the United States, addressed a letter on behalf of that organization to the free Africans and other people of color in the United States. Professing only the purest regard for their welfare and identifying his organization as friends and brethren, Foster wrote to notify the free Africans and other people of color of several resolutions passed concerning them. The way in which the Free African Union Society of Newport, Rhode Island responded demonstrates, I think, the high value that society and African Americans in general put on marriage contracts. And I think it also shows one of the ways in which African America guarded its rights to and rituals, its rights and rituals of making marital happiness. The abolitionists had passed 9 resolutions. They included things like regular church attendance, learning reading, writing, and enough math to do business, and ensuring that their children had a vocational skill as they were growing up, all of which were actually part of the reason that the free Africans had founded their union in the first place. But the Free African Society balked on the resolution that said, "We wish to impress upon your minds the moral and religious necessity of having your marriages legally performed, also to have exact registers preserved of all the deaths and births that occur in your respective families." The letter was sent in January, and for 11 months, apparently the society simply ignored that letter. Then on December 22nd, 1796, the society affirmed that legally performed marriages could be a great benefit and blessing, but it stipulated that they themselves were the only proper persons to officiate and legislate marriages in African America. What was at stake, the society believed and wrote, was nothing less than our happiness, the happiness of our children and of generations to come. Jonathan Haidt and others have found that certain environmental and demographic conditions contribute much less to an individual's happiness than we might assume. Happiness, they say, is within, and happiness can come from without. But one external condition seems vital. Haidt calls it relatedness, the bonds we form and need to form with others. Many happiness scholars, this always tickles me to call them happiness scholars, agree that finding meaning, purpose, and fulfillment in life is more important once, of course, you've got the basic need for food, shelter, clothing, and a sense of security. Once you've got the basics to survive, then meaning, purpose, and fulfillment in life is what's most important towards creating happiness. Many of them agree that connections are more important. And one of the things that they say is a good marriage is one of the life factors most strongly and consistently associated with happiness. Dependable companionship is a basic need. Religion can help, community, and anything that connects you with something larger. Now, antebellum African Americans had a lot of external conditions over which they had no control, but they could and did use what they did have or could create or appropriate. And I read the behavior of the Free African Union Society in this context. I also see signs of Haidt's happiness formula, the H equals S plus C plus V, in the writings that were published in Freedom's Journal. Freedom's Journal was a newspaper created, the first publication came out in 1827, which was the year that the enslaved people of African descent were legally free in New York. And that was the site of the publication, was New York City. And Freedom's Journal had the decidedly serious and significant purpose of changing the unhappy lot of our injured race by improving its moral, religious, civic, and literary status. The various contributors to this newspaper considered improvement from many angles, but the consistent implications, if not explicit claims, were that improvement led to happiness. And like today's scholars, the intellectuals of the 19th century in African America found it difficult to define happiness. A July 25th, 1828 original communication from Arion quotes Alexander Pope saying, "Oh, happiness, our being's end and aim, good pleasure, ease, content, whate'er thy name." He uses Pope to preface a long essay that makes his points that happiness is the philosopher's stone for which we are all seeking, and in many cases possess without the knowledge of it. Some equated happiness with spiritual purity, good deeds, legal freedom, and access to jobs, education, and security. For example, Freedom's Journal of March 7th, 1829, reminded readers that poverty is a great enemy to human happiness. It certainly destroys liberty and makes some virtues impracticable and others extremely difficult. But from its first issue to its last, Freedom's Journal linked happiness with marital behavior and attitudes. Consistently, the press advised that marriage was a basic foundation for happiness. A letter to the editor published on January 11th, 1828 is typical. "I am very much opposed to that state which is so emphatically termed single blessedness," its author wrote, and continues that I am of the opinion that mankind do not arrive at that height of felicity allowed them in this world unless they have entered the Elysian grove of Hymen. Yet I look upon marriage as the most solemn of all earthly engagements. It is a step on which depends the happiness for life of two rational beings. And in the Freedom's Journal, in the Christian Recorder, in the Repository of Religion and Literature and Science and Art, and other African-American media, all of them publish frequent and usually very didactic advice on how to make happy marriages. Generally, the advice was to marry only after serious reflection on its consequences and where two hearts are inseparably united with the bond of mutual and tender love, and promises that when the vices and virtues, failures and imperfections in the characters of both parties are familiarly known to each other, and if this acquaintance has no influence in discovering the attachment, there is a promise of all that happiness which the nuptial tie is eminently calculated to bestow. Being eminently calculated to bestow happiness is not synonymous with happiness being the inevitable result of nuptial ties. There are a lot of essays and pieces in there that talk about the problems that come when you fail to follow the advice, when you choose the wrong mate. And every once in a while, there's one in there on the joys of bachelorhood. But the overall theme is that marriage and happiness are a kind of symbiotic. They're the way it's supposed to be. Happiness, however, has to be made collaboratively. In an 1862 article published in San Francisco's Pacific Appeal, and I threw that in there because you tend to think of Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore as the centers of African-American life, and just wanted to know there are newspapers out on this coast. I mean, no, I'm not on this coast, on the coast where I like to be. The San Francisco Pacific Appeal argues that husbands should not try to assume absolute authority over and responsibilities for their wives and children. Tell your wives advises that judicious consultation will increase cooperation and make happiness more likely. If the wife knew more about the family finances, the author wrote, she would help relieve the husband's economic burden and make him a happier man. If husbands bring their wives into partnership, they will never regret it. The author assumes the man will be the breadwinner. And to me, the whole article is a bit sexist. For example, it warns the husbands that when they explain the economic realities to their wives, they should expect a slight shower at first, but that is natural. However, it does say that once the wife is over her tears and has absorbed the news, she will adjust, spend less, and actually point out ways to save more. The husband, however, or moreover, will find a wonderful change in her taste and appetites. Before he has thought much about it, he will find himself spending evenings at home, so full of domestic enjoyment and fireside pleasure that he will look with wonder on last year's expenses. My friends, the writer concludes, if your outgo exceeds your incomes, be sure and tell your wife of it. And if she does not come up heart and soul and most successfully to your relief, put me down for no judge. The Defense of Marriage Act and the Healthy Marriage Initiative and other political actions seem to assume a positive correlation between the status of being married and having more money, longer life, and well-adjusted children. But when studies factor happiness into the equations, the correlations appear to be confusing results with causation. In Is Marriage Good for Your Health?, journalist Tara Parker Pope reports that Jan Keecott Glasser of the Institute for Behavioral Medicine Research at Ohio State told me that the overall health lessons to take away from the new wave of marriage and health literature is that couples should first work to repair a troubled relationship and learn to fight without hostility or derision. But if staying married means living amid constant acrimony, from the point of view of your health, you're better off out of it. Early African Americans seems to have anticipated what scholars are now finding, that happiness is not the catalyst for or the result of marriage. Marriage is calculated to bestow lifelong happiness, but marriages must be contracted after rational thought, thorough research, and candid communication. And as the myriad articles on how to please your wife and how to please your husband and how to rear your children show, marital happiness is to be made. Now, the examples I've thus far cited do not exclude the enslaved population of early African America, but I think they're probably most relevant to the 500,000 or so who were legally free. Slavery had its peculiar problems, one of which was that under the law, slaves could not marry. However, in Till Death or Distance Do Us Part, I demonstrate that the laws against marriage were unable to prevent enslaved people from marrying and hoping to live happily ever after. I always like to think, we've got laws against speeding, against people drinking before they're 21. We have all kinds of laws. That does not mean, I think what a law means is that those in power are concerned about the behavior of those over whom they wish to keep power. And so they legislate those kinds of things that they want them not to do. It doesn't say much about what people actually do. Now run me out of auditorium. Many autobiographical writings, letters, and other documents prove that slaves put great stock in marriage, and indeed it was love and marriage and family that enabled them to endure and even transcend the oppression and depression of permanent servitude. One reason is that marriage, like happiness, is more than one's legal status or physical proximity. For example, consider the story of Henry and Melinda Bibb. Like many enslaved couples, Henry and Melinda Bibb had an abroad marriage. That is, they lived separately and visited on weekends or holidays. That period when Henry was married with Melinda, but they were living separately, kind of like a commuter marriage or being in the military or something like that, kind of like, not the same. Bibb says, that period was one of the happy seasons of my life. Though not legal, their marriage was recognized even by those who claimed ownership over their bodies. And when his legal owner decided to relocate, Henry arranged to be sold to Melinda's owner. But as happiness theorists tell us, sometimes what we think will make us happy proves otherwise. It was when the couple lived together that their happiness was infected. I was much dissatisfied, Bibb writes. Not that Gatewood was a more cruel master than my former owner, but that I was not that I was opposed to living with Melinda, who was then the center and object of my affections, but to live where I must be eyewitnesses to her insults, scourgings, and abuses, such as are common to be inflicted upon slaves, was more than I could bear. If my wife must be exposed to the insults and licentious passions of wicked slave drivers and overseers, if she must bear the stripes of the lash laid on by an unmerciful tyrant, if this is to be done with impunity, which is frequently done by slaveholders and their abettors, heaven forbid that I should be compelled to witness the sight. Bibb tries to make his happiness and hers by escaping from slavery. First, he ran away alone. Then he returned, not once, but 4 times, to rescue his wife and daughter. Each time he was captured, he escaped, And he tried it again. But theirs was not a story that ended happily ever after. Eventually, for various reasons, Bibb gave up the attempt to reunite with his wife, but he did not give up on the idea of marriage as a means to happiness. And a few years later, he met Miss Mary E. Miles of Boston, and after a year's engagement, Bibb wrote that, "We had the happiness to be joined in holy wedlock." You know, it's worth noting here that this second marriage was not legal either. Bibb was a fugitive. Legally, he was still a slave. Another telling example is that of Isaac Foreman, who lived as a slave in Norfolk, Virginia, and his wife lived in Richmond. They were allowed to visit only once or twice a year. So when in December 1854, Isaac Foreman got the chance to escape to Canada, he took it. Almost immediately, he wrote to William Steele, who was an African-American conductor on the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. He wrote to Steele seeking help in rescuing his wife. Foreman's letter shows both a way in which early African-Americans tried to change their conditions and a reason why some remained in slavery. When Steele and company proved too slow, Foreman wrote again. He says, "What is freedom to me when I know that my wife is in slavery?" His letter of May 7th, 1854 reveals the strong, deep love he had for the wife with whom he had not lived for more than a few days, a couple times a year. He says, "My soul is vexed. My troubles are inexpressible. I often feel as if I were willing to die. I must see my wife. In short, if not, I will die. What would I not give? No tongue can utter. Just to gaze on her sweet lips one moment, I would be willing to die the next. I am determined to see her some time or other. If I had known as much before I left as I do now, I would never have left until I could have found the means to have her brought with me. You must oblige me by seeing Mr. Brown and asking him if he would oblige me by going to Richmond and seeing my wife and see what arrangement he can make with her, and I will be willing to pay all his expenses there and back. I am determined to see her if I die the next moment. I can say I was once happy, but never will be again until I see her, because what is freedom to me when I know that my wife is in slavery?" Sometimes people have questioned the choices that many enslaved people apparently made not to run away. Whether being legally free compensates for not being with spouses, family, and friends has similarities to the dilemmas we sometimes face when our individual aspirations or desires compete with our domestic happiness, our responsibilities, our love relationships. The way in which happiness was made in early African America varied, as were the conditions under which they lived and the voluntary actions they could take. Remember Jonathan Haidt's happiness formula, H equals S plus C plus V. Sometimes changes in conditions, C, and voluntary actions, V, are not unambiguously positive. My final example comes from a short story. The author does not preface the story by avowing that it is a work of fiction, the names of which have been changed, and any resemblance to any person living or dead is purely coincidental. He doesn't do that, or she. Most early African American fiction, however, wove together facts and fiction for the edification of its readers and the memorializing of heroic individuals. Moreover, in this story, which is called Patrick Brown's First Love, was published in 1859, this story fits within the badman genre of folk tales and actually resembles antebellum literature written by Frederick Douglass and Victor Chajour and Martin Delany and others who avowed the truth, if not the factuality, of their fiction. Patrick Brown's First Love begins with 2 lines of poetry that equate romantic love with happiness. Hail, young love, cream of all earthly bliss, the silken down of happiness complete. The narrator follows this lyric with the declaration that slavery has not blotted out the kingly passion of a man's love for a woman. Then the author goes further with a radical reversal of common wisdom in antebellum Euro-America by declaring that sensibility and finely honed emotions are more characteristic of African Americans than of Euro-Americans. These children of the sun, the narrator says, love as the white man cannot, and in blasted love, anguish as the white man cannot. Many a white man, owner, or overseer, relying on the apparently soft and subdued characters of their slaves, have invaded the slaves' married bed and met the bloody end they deserve. Patrick Brown lived freely in a slave state. Even though he'd been born a slave, he was not emancipated legally, and he did not hide his legal status. For a while, we're told, Brown worked diligently for any person who purchased him. That is, he worked conscientiously until someone mistreated him. Then that someone met a mysterious death. Brown was suspected, but never implicated. And yes, we learned that Brown did, in fact, and so, pretty soon nobody wanted to buy him because something always happens. So he was free in the South. And we learned why? We learned that Brown did, in fact, kill these owners. Why? Because of love. In his early youth, Patrick had loved Keisha with a love that was passionate and boundless. And Keisha loved Patrick too. The twain were one in all time and forever, and they were purified in the very depth and truthfulness of their love. But Keisha and Patrick became part of a coffle being transported for sale, and one of the slave traders began to sexually harass Keisha. First, he tried to seduce her, but she ignored him. Then he threatened her. She resisted. Finally, he had Keisha bound, gagged, and carried to a wagon that was set a little way apart from the others. That night, the man went in, and all was quiet. Late the next morning, when no sounds were heard, one of the drivers pulled aside the curtain. There lay the slave driver, disemboweled, and there, unstained by his guilty touch with death, beautiful, oh how beautiful, on her virgin brow lay Patrick Brown's first love. Why did Keisha have to die? This beautiful virgin is in the 19th century, and no true lady can withstand such sordid experiences without dying, I think. And besides, it's Patrick's story, so she's just a prop, I think. Patrick Brown had been happily married, but someone had intruded upon his domestic bliss. Brown's voluntary actions were to kill that person and anyone who insulted him. In the prime of health, the narrator writes, Brown made slavery tired of him, have nothing to do with him. Did he make himself happy again? It's hard to tell. The reader is left at the end to recall words written at the story's beginning. Most of the deeds of violence perpetuated by the slaves, which reached the newspapers, have this passion, happiness, I think, as their source, and thousands of fierce, brave revenges, which never reach the public ear, are prompted in like manner. I realize that the examples given here contradict much of the common wisdom about family marriage and sexual morality in African America. I'm just hoping that it contradicts it so much that you find it provocative and applicable to other situations as well. If you're provoked, I urge you to read the data for yourselves. You could start with the anthology I edited because it has a collection of folk tales, songs, sermons, essays, letters, diaries, all kinds of things from early African American print culture, and it gives their sources, so it will save you a little bit of library search. But many of these sources are accessible in Emory's library stacks in marble. Many are online For example, the Freedom's Journal and the Christian Recorder are part of the Accessible Archive series, and you can just click on with your handy computers. My purpose in this presentation are many. First, it's to call attention to what truths we hold self-evident, how truthful are the truths we hold, what the pursuit of happiness means or is intended to mean. I'm calling attention to an era of legal enslavement in the United States, not merely because I think it is the most salient characteristic of our history and our present, but a factor we tend to forget or ignore or downplay when going to the Tea Party and talking about our constitutional rights. Remember, slaves were only 3/5 human. It took 3 amendments to pave the way for African America to participate as citizens. And you know, quiet as it's kept, women's rights have not been affirmed yet. The ERA didn't pass. So I do this kind of in the spirit of helping us come closer to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about our country, our history, and what we might want to do about it. Second, I'm actually saying that perceptions of history play serious roles in pursuing and in making happiness. Happiness scholars tend to argue that our emotions, our reactions to events, and some mental illnesses are caused by the mental filters through which we look at the world. Scholars tend to agree also that our attitudes and our actions, our perceptions and psyches, our sense of ourselves and of our possibilities are created by a complex interaction of external and internal data. The way in which others identify us, Hilda Lindman Nelson explains, establishes what they will permit us to do. This restricts our freedom to act. How we identify ourselves establishes our own view of what we can do. This too restricts our moral agency. Both external and internal influences form what Nelson calls mandatory identities, which in turn set up expectations about how group members are to behave, what they can know, to whom they are answerable, and what others may demand of them. When a powerful group or person oppresses a less powerful group or person, the result is unequal opportunities and damaged identities. To make it worse, the damaged persons may internalize the disrespect and believe that they are indeed as they have been told they are. I know that many Americans have damaged identities, and some of that damage comes from distorted and incomplete histories. Knowing more about how African Americans make happiness, or how they made it, does not mitigate the sin of slavery and the second-class citizenship, but it does offer counter-narratives that can be used to make some kind of happiness. You see, I believe that history is a narrative that nurtures now. I believe that, like Faulkner famously wrote in Requiem for a Nun, the past is not dead, it is not even past. Or Proverbs 23:7, in some Bibles, not all of them, some leave this out, but Proverbs 23:7 says it this way. I paraphrase it, as a person thinks, so that person becomes. From the happiness hypothesis, I learned that Buddha said it this way: what we are today comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our present thoughts build our life of tomorrow. Our life is the creation of our mind. And whether we prefer the pursuit of happiness or to make happiness, or a bit of both, I think it's essential to realize that what we know and what we do are processes. And so far, it seems that making process brings happiness, whatever that is. That was the end. That was the cool end. It was the attempt to...
That was not just a cool end, that was a cool speech. I think she needs another round of applause.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.